Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to welcome you in this webinar series about nutrition, equine nutrition, about health, well-being, and performance in horses. So this is one of the webinar series organized by the EAAP, and it's one of the first ones with the Horse Commission. So this Horse Commission in the EAAP is a 10-people commission, one of the old commission of this organization. It aims to support research and development in the industry of horses and share knowledge. We have key topics, historical key topics in the Horse Commission. Among those, genetics, nutrition, and we'll speak of this one today, welfare, health, reproduction, and sustainable agriculture. And among the more recent topics developed in this commission, we also have socioeconomy, equine education, therapeutic riding, and milk production. So today, as I said, we'll make a focus on nutrition, and will be three speakers to animate this conference today, which will last for 2 hours. So we welcome first Dr. Andrea Ellis from UK. She will start. So Andrea is specializing in nutrition, of course, but also in ethology and animal welfare and ethics. She will introduce herself in more details, but about her research topics. She works about ingestive and digestive physiology in horses, also in the ridden horse ethogram, in behavioral indicators of discomfort, stress, pain, or in environmental enrichment of horses. And so she'll discuss of some of these topics in relation to nutrition and work. I'll continue later with half an hour about nutrition and health. Myself, so I'm a member of the EAAP Horse Commission, as well as Emanuela, who will close the discussion afterwards. So myself, I work as a researcher in a research organization in digestive physiology and pathophysiology. So I have the research team called Lab to Field. I present it later a little bit. And the aim is to better understand functioning of horses to promote health, welfare, and performance. So I'm involved to head research projects in nutrition behavior, nutrition performance, nutrition health. And Emanuela Valle, Professor Emanuela Valle from Turin in Italy, will close this session. So she's full professor in the University of Torino, involved as a European specialist in vet comparative nutrition. And among her research topics, she focuses on promoting equine welfare through integration of nutrition, management, and exercise. And she's also managing research project to investigate innovative feeding devices and their effects on posture and forage intake, on feeding behavior. She will detail this and present her research group also. To conclude this introduction, you can type your questions into the chat box here, and the chair, in the end of the presentations will last 25 to 30 minutes, will have time for some questions in the end of each presentation, and during the conclusion also, if some questions can be discussed again. And should you want more information, you have here the link to the EAAP website. The next conference will be in Hanover in September, and the webinar will be available for some months afterwards. So, Andrea, it's your turn.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sammy. I was asked to just do a very short introduction of myself. So, as Sammy said, my PhD was in ingestive and digestive physiology in horses and sheep. And so I've been hooked on nutrition and health and behavior, especially in horses, ever since. I run my own company now called UNEQUI Limited, Research and Creativity. And I've been working on behavior as much as nutrition in the last 20 years or so. Here you can see some of my research topics, and Sammy mentioned some of those already. So I don't want to linger too long on what I do, but go more to the content of what you want to know, really. And that is talking about equine nutrition and welfare. So as Sammy said, there's going to be 3 presentations on welfare and nutrition for performance horses. So I'm going to be focusing on the nutrition and welfare, in particular on the mental health of horses. We've sort of come a long way since the early 5 freedoms of good welfare for animals were laid down. We moved towards providing a life worth living, and really now the ultimate goal is to have a good life. This was particularly laid down by the white paper published by Eurogroup for Animals and some ethology specialists, and they have come up with the 5 key areas to ensure a good life for horses. So obviously nutrition is interlinked into that quite considerably. From this, sort of starting with the end in mind, our end outcome is that we have specialized nutrition and hydration welfare behavior indicators. And here's just an example of what they could look like. Horses should be able to have a choice of different forage types and be able to choose different feedstuffs as they go along. But what does that mean in practice? Provide at least 2 or 3 types of conserved forages, and including grass. Try and avoid single sward grasses, for example. Then forage should be presented in an adequate and safe manner, of course, clean and of good hygienic quality. Having choices is a really important aspect of mental health, where the horses can choose whether they go inside or outside a stable, whether they can choose different areas of a field, a shelter, etc. So in groups and herds, if living in groups or herds, we should provide them with enough feeding stations to avoid bullying and allow equal access for all. And then we have some very specific recommendations that owners can check against their own horses. 24 access to fresh, clean water is the ideal situation. And then an absolute minimum of 8 hours, but an optimum of 12 hours per 24 hours of the ability to carry out foraging behavior. And that actually means avoid fasting periods for more than 4 hours. And then in terms of stabling, there should be a kind of mild anticipation of feed arrival, if there is such a thing. Because if there's no anticipation, there's also something not quite right with the mental health of the animal. But we should really avoid this really hectic, panic sort of type feeding times that have traditionally occurred twice a day. So that was a big slide with a lot of text, and don't worry, we will come back to all of this. So a little bit of rest for your eyes. Why is the next section of the talk really? Why and what evidence do we have to come up with these very specific recommendations? So first of all, let us define the key issue at the center of all of these recommendations, and that is to facilitate a most natural foraging behavior. So natural forage behavior is so much more than just ingesting hay, grass, haylage, or feed. Foraging involves at the center of it browsing, feeling, touching, sniffing, tasting, evaluating, biting, chewing, swallowing, and eventually moving on to the next food. But in the peripheral behavior, it also is intrinsically linked to exploring, walking, rambling, resting, and to the social interaction, the mirroring of the other horses, the herd safety, the vigilance. From a historic point of view, we have really focused very much on counting feed intake behavior. And there are a series of studies available which have been carried out, some for 24-hour observations, but these are minimal, and some for spot observations. On average, around on average, horses will spend about 10 to 15 distinct feeding bouts per 24 hours per day. And they do that using multiple feed sources, swords, and types. The maximum hours recorded, the mean maximum hour recorded from all these studies that are brought together was 4 hours continuous non-feeding bouts, normally during bad weather conditions. And the feed intake ranged anything from 10 to 18 hours, but the most common recorded feed intake was between 12 and 14 hours, and the average was about 13 hours. So in this next example here of a 24-hour nighttime budget recorded in feral conic horses, it really highlights that horses will rest the longest round about from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning. And this was recorded over 2 years in the summer and in the winter. And every time you can see the red line indicating the slight dip in a reduction in feed intake behavior. I've put on the scale the 0.6, so that's 60% of the time of each hour that was recorded or period that was recorded. And that highlights that they are spending about 60% of their time on foraging behavior. What about our domesticated horses then? By all evidence, they still have the same urge to carry out their natural foraging activities, and all that is included within that. But let's have a look at the evidence. The picture here, by the way, is a 1-day-old foal already copying its mare in food intake behavior, although at that point it wasn't really eating grass yet, just sort of licking it a little bit. We observed some Icelandic horses in Shetland living outdoors. They come in to be ridden and then they go back out again. And they live outdoors most of the year. Very, very rarely are they brought in. We observed them for 72 hours, so 3 times 24 hours, and they seemed to spend an equal amount of time on the hill area where there was a lot of browse and heather and what you would call probably poor grass, and they spent as much time there than they did on the lower pasture areas, even when there was a lot of grass, and even in spring, which was surprising. We can also see from their time budget that it falls in line with the feral conic horses from earlier. They very much spent the whole night time foraging, but resting the most during the early hours of the morning up to 6 o'clock. Obviously, it shifted considerably because the daylight hours change very largely in the Shetland Islands. And the few studies we have where horses are browsing or foraging for 16 to 18 hours are normally in springtime in the very high northern atmosphere where there is a lot of light. And it's probably a kind of rebound behavior after a long dark winter. If we then look at horses that are housed in stables in and out of paddocks at various times of the year, this study by Nash et al. Showed that the activity in the stable again shows continual foraging during the whole night period, with the lowest foraging behavior occurring just after midnight. We then turned those horses out. We did a crossover with the young and older horses, and you can see that when they were out in a paddock where they received the same amount of hay available to them as they did in the stable, as well as the grassland, they spent 40 to 50 minutes, an hour nearly, throughout the night foraging, apart from those last few 3 hours in the morning. So it really highlights the importance of forage behavior. And one of my earliest hypotheses was that there was an ethological requirement to chew, because I looked particularly at chewing behavior, in order to keep the passage rates moving, the trickle feeding of the digestive system, produce saliva, etc. And we often focused on this micro intake behavior of horses, but perhaps the chewing is not as much the importance as the actual behavior of food intake and the foraging behavior. Early studies often thought that hunger and satiety might be play an important role in the onset of food intake behavior, even in horses, but we'll have a look at that a little bit closer. So there are ad libitum feed intake studies in stabled horses, which were presented forages. And we can see they focused very much on percent dry matter intake per kilo body weight. And so that's where we get our advice from, 2% of body weight per day in terms of volume. However, in my research particularly also, I wanted to look a little bit more at what that meant for feed intake type retrospectively. So if we look at that data retrospectively, we can see that again, these horses were actually spending about 8 to 16 hours per 24 hours on feed intake when they were offered ad libitum types of forages. The straw being the lowest, because of course it takes the longest time to chew, and there is a volume effect in the end which seems to turn off that desire. Other research highlights that there is a time-related intake factor. Argo et al. Fed a complete diet to ponies and ad libitum, and as the trial started up to day 25, you can see that they started continuously increasing their intake up to 28 kilos per day, which seems massive, and certainly more than double fulfilled all their requirements in terms of nutrients. But even at such a pelleted diet, that only led to around about 8 hours of ingestive behavior. Hennig et al. Did a similar study. She offered pelleted feed, again leading to around 20 kilos of intake per day, and to feeding times of around 7.6 to 8 hours. Once hay was offered alongside those pellets, they switched fairly quickly to ingesting the forage instead. And then when they were turned out on grass, the pellets were still made available to them, but they moved on to grass very quickly and ignored the pellets. So all these studies really underline the feed intake timing might play a vital role. In this study, I carried out with 36 Dutch warm blood horses. We fed them a high fiber or a low fiber diet. And you can see both groups topped up their feed intake behavior with foraging in the bedding. And we really only expected this from the low fiber group. If you add those behaviors together, this foraging behavior and the low fiber group was doing an awful lot of feces eating, you can see once again that at least 9 horses, at least 9 hours in the 24 hours were spent on feed intake behavior in the stable. So this ethological requirement for chewing behavior, or in this case foraging behavior, is really proven in many studies again and again. So possibly hunger and satiety can be crossed off our list of being a major controller of horses stopping to eat. Most likely hunger might control the onset of food intake behavior, but there might be other controllers at work. So in terms of welfare, there seems to be a very natural urge to carry out this foraging behavior through neurological pathways. Hormones might be the hunger trigger and regulator, but they then lead to the onset of this goal-directed behavior, and there are dopamine receptors involved, of course, in rewarding the behavior as it continues. In terms of welfare, then blocking this very strong behavioral urge, which is any kind of behavioral urge, if you remember, is very ingrained into a species for survival purposes. So if you block that, it can lead to the onset of anxiety and stress. So this is where we start to get replacement behavior if they cannot fulfill that behavioral goal. Some studies highlight that it might indicate that these horses cope better with the stress due to the replacement behaviors they carry out. And for some horses, this may be enough, but for other horses, this may not be enough. So they might develop stereotypic behaviors which are disassociated of the original goal behavior. It has been shown that they have differences in the dopamine receptors and neural signaling. So that might link also to differences in their learning and habit forming abilities. But that does not mean that the other horses that do not develop that behavior are not experiencing poor mental states or stress or poor welfare. And that's a really important point to make. So quite often, oral stereotypies are linked to nutrition or a lack of adequate foraging behavior. It can be, though, that a stereotypy can be triggered by different causes. And so foraging behavior on the whole, which includes the locomotion and the social interaction, is very hard to distinguish from any of the stereotypies. And horses react very differently. In a study I carried out, we saw that horses fed one horse in particular we just had two horses as a sideline to this study, so a little pilot study. One horse was seen to crib bite considerably more during any kind of feed provision, whether it was forage or concentrate feed, but particularly after concentrate feed. But the other horse, the blue horse line you can see here, started performing crib biting, particularly sort of after 11 o'clock midnight onwards, when the forage in the stable started to diminish. So two very different onsets of crib biting behavior, and possibly two very different reasons why they developed those behaviors. To sum up on those stereotypic behaviors and really on the impairment of welfare in general, lack of foraging opportunities is probably the key issue here. And we can see these key onset periods in studies highlighting that weaning time and confinement and lack of social interaction play a really important role when the behavior first starts. Quite often when that is remedied, the behavior might disappear, but then will return at the next major stressful or chronic stress situation. And of course, pain or discomfort will always link into a stressful experience or poor mental state. So here for nutrition in particular, we look at malnutrition or incorrect nutrition. So that might be too much or too little of something, and more about that obviously in the next two webinars sessions. So how can we then optimize a good life for our stabled horses? Nowadays, a range of housing systems and management strategies are available. In a way, the original housing of small boxes and lock them up and don't let them see each other was very much creating a poverty environment. So now we talk about enriching that environment again and to try and mimic more natural foraging behavior for horses. Coming back to these stress periods, I think we really need to try and avoid these stressful feeding times. Horses become really agitated when their concentrate feed arrive, especially in the morning if they had 3 or 4 hours of enforced fasting because there was nothing left in the stable. Here's just an example of a horse with a heart rate of up to 160 beats per minute in the 5 to 10 minutes prior to feed arriving. We took the heart rates of 6 horses for 2 weeks in order to measure this. And this sort of heart rate rise will trigger a cascade of hormones, obviously implicating cortisol, and then feed might arrive and it might just be 1.5 kilos of pellets, which is gone within 15 minutes. And then where do they go with their hormones and their excitement? So that could well be the reason why this one horse developed stereotypic behavior and severely increased that during feeding times. What we then did with these horses, we moved them to a yard where they had no communications and sound access to other yards, which had normal feeding times. And we started to replace their meal feeding by simply providing a layer of feedstuffs in their feed bins, which were topped with a hay net to slow them down on ingestive behavior, and the pellets they normally received were filled in between different layers. They were riding school horses and they worked for about 3 hours per day. And you can see, of course, that the slow feeders which were supplied and only ever topped up when the horses were not in the stable, so there was no excitement about feed arriving or anything. The stable always came with these feeders full up, and at night they had 2 feeders to keep them going all night. You can see that their food intake behavior, it was slowed down by the slow feeders, plus they were much busier feeding from that than feeding and foraging in their bedding. And they also showed less anxiety. In another study, we replaced a single hay net with 3 hay nets, and on top of that, 2 of the hay nets were double hay nets and a triple hay net. And you can see here that in the single hay net, the nighttime behavior is as expected. They get their hay net, they forage, 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 and then slowly after midnight, the green line becomes nearly non-existent and it's just bedding foraging. When we switched that to the triple provision of forage, first of all, it was interesting to see how they moved around the stable to keep switching between hay nets, although they could just eat from one hay net at a time. But also they increased their behavior. The double hay net certainly slowed the intake behavior down. They did receive 1 less kilo hay in the triple hay net, so the 6 kilos were divided 5 kilos between the single and the double, and only 1 kilo in the triple hay net because we were worried they wouldn't get enough hay out of that. And it did make their nighttime budget very much more similar to perhaps the more feral or outdoor living horses. However, they also got very, very frustrated with their triple hay net when they couldn't get the feed out. So I would not normally recommend a triple hay net unless you really have a horse that has to go on a very low calorie intake diet. But from that, we wanted to find out more it's no good alleviating perhaps general welfare by providing more foraging time, but then reducing the physiological welfare of the body and possibly of the teeth if they're ripping really hard on the hay net. So we looked at the posture and at the pressure that horses also exert on their incisor teeth when eating from these hay nets. What we found really was that the single and double hay nets, on average, the pull pressure was not too different. It was slightly higher on the double hay net. They just got out a lot less rather than pulling harder. And round about 5 kilos is the pressure on the incisor teeth when they're pulling hard on a filled hay net. There is only one other study out there on grazing horses and supplying grass through a specialized system, and they also came to around 5 kilos of pressure on the really higher sward grasses. So, but there's not enough control to really say that. However, there was some very high pressure on triple hay nets, so we wouldn't recommend those necessarily. Since then, I've also had the real honor of joining research team at the University of Turin, and Emanuela will tell you much more about that. And we look at the in-depth at the effect of slow feeders and automatic feeders on horses, both physiologically and behaviorally, to really look at how does it affect them in their posture, in their body morphology, how does that affect their reaction and their posture. And we also use some automatic feeders to really highlight what is the ideal timing. And some preliminary results show that if you start closing the door too early after horses have access to forage, they can become very frustrated and quite angry with the machine. So again, it highlights the importance of this foraging behavior. At the moment, we're thinking 50 minutes onwards is necessary before you have a resting period. But it certainly would be a way of reducing intake while keeping foraging throughout the night. And here, a really interesting applied way of doing this, the perfect solution really, if it can work, and it does work at the moment really well in this top riding school in the Netherlands, is a system designed by my colleague Machteld van Deendonk. They have a really large indoor-outdoor housing area. Horses can go out and inside as they wish. They have a feeding area and they have a sleeping and resting area. A feeding robot dispenses haylage every 3 hours, day and night. And there are specific solutions which I've seen with particular barriers to avoid bullying and allow access to also even the smallest of horses in this big group housing system. And when horses need to be ridden, they're just simply taken out into a holding area and prepared. So you can imagine I could talk on this forever, but hopefully I've provided a snippet of large-scale evidence to why we have derived the recommendations that we have now in order to provide a good life for horses. Just to sum these up then, and this is where I'm back at the beginning of my talk, these are exactly the same points that I mentioned then. First of all, ensure choice and variation for horses. They like to have a choice going inside, outside, and I'm including equids here, so I've managed to smuggle some donkeys in. And ensure that fasting is more an option for them rather than enforced onto them. So resting periods and non-foraging periods are their choice. Ensure that they ideally have 12 hours a day, evenly spread day and night to be spent on foraging behavior. Remember those 15 different feeding pouts they normally practice if in a natural situation. And they should be able to do this in a safe and free environment from competition and good hygienic environment. And this will greatly contribute to the horse's experience to have a good life. And finally, of course, welfare does not end there, especially in relation to nutrition. So very important in relation to nutrition is that absence and freedom from pain and discomfort. And here nutrition also plays a really vital aspect for the horse to have a good life. And with that, I really hand you over to Sammy for the next presentation, who will focus on this, and then Emanuela as well. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So indeed, should you have any questions, do not hesitate to write that in the chat, and we'll have time to take one or two questions. No question for now. For you, Andrea? You mentioned, Andrea, different type of dry forage. Does it include silage, for example, for your recommendations?
Yeah. Well, I think the silage was particularly included on those voluntary feed intake trials, which were done about 15, 20 years ago or longer even. Some people still feed silage. I would probably not recommend feeding silage to horses myself, because it is slightly more acidic than we would like to hit the stomach with initially. But yeah, if you have a few handfuls here and there, some horses take to it after a while, but they normally initially reject it until they get used to it as well. So from a behavior point of view, it's probably not their preferred taste.
Yes. Another question for you. Why two sorts of roughage?
Well, horses do like to browse and have choices, just like we do. And also, if you have two types of forage that you're offering, they often complement each other. And most horse owners actually feed quite often some legume forage like lucerne as well as hay. And then horses have the third type of forage, which of course is the grass itself. So it gives them a wider variety of food, but it also gives them a wider variety of nutrients if there are different plant sources involved.
Can these two sources of forage be straw and hay?
Yes, they can be, of course. I mean,
Straw
in
for
terms of
bedding?
nutrients, the straw will not add much to the diet. So, but possibly if you have an obese horse, the straw might slow their intake behavior down. And for sure, they will try and pick out every piece of hay first. But even that will slow them down. So if you have to have a sort of calorie restricted diet, and some straws like barley straw can be quite palatable to horses as well.
Last question for you, Andrea. What do you recommend doing when the hay is of low quality?
Okay, so if it's of poor quality in terms of hygiene, i.e. it may be dusty, or there might be even some contamination. Contamination, of course, I would say you should really avoid that if there's some soil contamination. But if it's just poor quality in terms of being dusty due to the weather conditions when it was harvested, I would say a quick short soak would sort that out. in terms of energy, that is a different type of quality. So if it's poor energy quality and the horse requires more energy, then again, switching to a earlier cut, higher energy hay would be better, and then adding perhaps some legume forage like lucerne. I don't know if that answers the question.
Many thanks, Andrea. And
Okay.
we'll get back to some of the questions in the end of the talk if we have time.
Okay.
So I'll continue with a topic about nutrition and health. I started with a very brief presentation of our research team. So the research team is located in France, in Dijon, and there is quite a long-standing history about this because it started in the 50s. So I'm not the first one to head the research team. And we have two sites on location. One is in the university. We're very lucky to have a huge biology research university in Dijon. And just close to the university, we have a farm which is dedicated to research and which enables carrying research projects under controlled conditions, in addition to other clinical trials, for instance, that we carry in the field. And in this farm, in addition to other ruminants or pig species, we have a herd of equines. And so we work a lot with this, and this is our basis to carry research projects. And we're lucky in the same location to have researchers in digestive physiology, in microbiology, in immunology, in parasitology, etc. But also this stable to manage research projects under controlled conditions, and this enable working on how the horse digests and what are the relations between digestion and the host. And finally, in the same location, we also have the lab. And in total, in the team, we are 20 to 25 people working in this specific area. Our expertise is mostly to work in digestive physiology. And so what we like is studying how the animal will digest. And to do so, we try to open the black box. So the first way to modulate digestion is to modulate nutrition. So we study a lot how nutrition will influence digestion, but it's not the only way to modulate digestion. It will be modulated with medicines, with stresses, with age, etc. So we study all this, but mostly nutrition. And when we speak of digestion, necessarily we speak of microbiology, specifically in herbivores, because horses, as other herbivores, will only rely on their microbes to digest fibers. And what is of interest to us is then to look at the consequences. What are the modifications in digestion, and what are the consequences on production, on health, on the well-being, performance, energy metabolism, performance, for instance, or environmental consequences. And today I'll make a focus specifically on two topics related to health. So, just as a brief introduction, I'll start with the energy sources for the horse. So, usually when we ask owners what are the sources of energy for their animals, traditionally their first answer will be concentrates. So this will be the first energy source we think of. And indeed, it will provide energy, mostly thanks to cereals, thanks to starch contained in cereals, and 1 kilo of cereals will provide the same amount of energy as 2 to 3 kilograms of hay. But it will not be through the same molecules. In one case, it's from starch, in the other one from fibers. And this will also provide the same amount of energy as 30 milliliters fat. So in the horse, we are lucky, we can choose different sources of energy we provide the animal, but it will not have the same effect on the body. And in some cases, it can be related to some troubles. And so, if we look at the digestive tract, there is a horse inside out. We have a long esophagus leading to the stomach. And then we have the stomach, a little pocket, the small intestine, which is not so small because it will be 20 to 25 meters in the horse, and then a huge large intestine, which will be about 100 liters, containing both the cecum, the ventral column, the dorsal column, etc. I figured it out like this. You have the stomach here, the small intestine, and the large intestine. When the horse eats starch or sugar, This will first stay for a while in the stomach and being fermented. We have their bacteria that will use starch and sugar, ferment this, and produce volatile fatty acids. In this segment, under acidic conditions, it's detrimental for health. And I will give you some examples on this relation between starch and gastric diseases. Then, if we move forward, the starch that bypasses digestion in the stomach will reach the small intestine, and once again, some bacteria will continue fermenting this. But in this segment, we will also have an important secretions, including alpha-amylase secretions, and these ones will free glucose. And glucose originating from starch will here be absorbed and lead to a glycemic response. So when the horse ingests a diet containing starch and sugar, non-structural carbohydrate, some minutes or hours after, we'll observe an increase in glycemia. And this will be modulated thanks to insulin. And so we have also a modulation in insulin to maintain a glycemic homeostasis. So this is normal in the horse, it's the same as in us, but we should take care. It's not the topic I will develop here. It's still in relation with health. We should take care of this insulin modulation because in some sensitive subgroups, like in very young animals, like in very old animals, this can lead to different troubles. And in animals that are insulin resistant, either naturally because they age or because they exhibit diseases, the production of insulin to maintain the same glycemic response will need to be huge, and this will have consequences in all the functions of the body. So as I said, it's not the topic today, but the horse will be extremely sensitive to these variations and can exhibit different metabolic diseases following ingestion of starch and sugar diets. Second point to provide energy to the horse is fibers. I won't speak of oils today in 30 minutes, but when the horse eats fibers, the fibers will go through the entire digestive tract without being fermented or hydrolyzed by endogenous enzymes. And in the large intestine, the huge microbiota inhabiting the cecum and the colon will ferment cellulose and hemicellulose and pectins and provide immense amounts of volatile fatty acids. This will be the first energy source for the horse, even in case of large concentrate parts in the diet, proportion in the diet. This volatile fatty acids originating from fiber digestion will be the most important proportion of energy in the animal. The problem is that this ecosystem in the large intestine is very fragile. And either because of dietary stresses or medical stresses or transportation, it can disturb the equilibrium in the large intestine and lead to shifts, which are called dysbiosis, with consequences on nutrition, because digestion of fibers will not be so efficient, but also consequences for health. And so this will be the second topic I will detail just after. So we'll start first with examples of relations between nutrition and gastric diseases. In the horse, here is the stomach that we have when it's fully dilated. You have in the dorsal part a squamous mucosa, which is not secretory, and in the ventral part, a glandular mucosa, which will produce all the secretions in the stomach. And the gastric lake lies on this ventral part. And here we have both solid digesta and all the liquid saliva, secretions, etc. It looks like this, and depending on the meal, we'll have more solids or more liquid phases in the stomach. In the stomach, it's been ignored for quite a long time, but there is a huge digestion finally. The transit time is not so short. It's been illustrated by works 2 decades ago, where some colleagues show that only a 1.5 kilo meal will stay in the stomach for on average 2 to 3, 4 hours. And the more starch, the longer it will stay in the stomach. And then it's been measured that there were some disappearances of sugars, starch, proteins in the stomach due to mostly the microbiota inhabiting this segment. And this leads to fermentations that are extremely intense. And in the hours following a meal, especially a meal containing starch and sugar, we have a huge increase in the concentration of volatile fatty acids. And this will be detrimental for the gastric health. In the stomach, we also have two different mucosae, and these will be associated to different diseases. The squamous mucosa can be confronted to squamous gastric diseases, while the glandular one exhibits glandular gastric diseases. These ones, I'll start with these ones, they are much more described. They look like this, and you have ulcerations on the surface of the squamous mucosa. It's been explained because these cells forming the epithelium of the squamous mucosa will die when the pH decreases below 4. And there is a risk of erosion or even ulceration when it's very deep. It's been explained by some colleagues through in ex vivo approaches, some decades ago, and the epithelium in the squamous mucosa is made like this. You have cells forming the epithelium, and these cells exchange permanently fluids with their environment. And the volume of cells, the pressure, the intracellular pressure, is monitored thanks to ions. In the membrane of cells, we have pumps called sodium-potassium pumps that will work permanently to maintain a good pressure within the cell. When the pH decreases, these pumps will start dysfunctioning. And with the dysfunction, sodium within the cell will increase. And with this increase in sodium concentration, it's associated with retention of water and cell swelling. If it's of short duration, then the cell returns to physiological status briefly, shortly. But if it's for a longer duration, then the intracellular pressure will become so important that the membrane will break down and the cell will die. So this is the beginning of the ulceration. So what makes the pH decrease in the stomach? So first of all, it's the secretions of acid, chlorhydric acid. And these ones are permanent in the horse. They are continuous due to parietal cells in the glandular mucosa. And usually when the horse is fed traditional diets, or when we let him the choice, the horse will eat, as said in there, all through the day. And so when we have horses with hay or pasture ad libitum, the horse will continuously produce saliva, and also the ingested materials will provide buffer. And so the pH close to this squamous mucosa will remain close to 5, 6, so it's not dangerous. But when the pH drops, when the horse is fasted for a period, the pH rapidly drops. So there is no more buffer, but stomach continues secreting acids. And then when we let the horse again possibility to have hay, it increases again. This is highly risky because after 4 to 6 hours, we see that the cells start dying in the surface of the epithelium. And it's a model to induce ulcers. It's quite different. The second point, which is highly problematic, is VFAs, because volatile fatty acids are acids. They contribute to acidity, but more than all, they will irreversibly alter cell functioning. So when you have acidic conditions plus acid in the gastric content, a volatile fatty acid in the gastric content, these acids will be in a form which is liposoluble and which can enter through the epithelium. And then this will disturb, once again, irreversibly the functioning of the cells. And this will lead to much deeper ulcerations. It will be bleeding. We will reach the submucosa or even the muscular layers that be below the epithelium. So, quite logically, the recommendations in terms of dietary recommendations will be to limit fasting periods. Once again, as said Andrea, the horse is not made to fast. And second point will be to control, to minimize the intake of easily fermentable substrates, especially the substrates that would stay for long in the stomach. And when we face acidic conditions, will produce extremely high amounts of volatile fatty acids. And finally, incorporating ingredients that will buffer, in addition to saliva, acidity in the content could be of interest, especially when we face stresses. The stomach, I figured it out like this, but when the horse is working, we have huge pressure in the stomach, and it's compressed, extremely compressed. And so the squamous mucosa will face the fluids that are aggressive. If we feed the horse prior to train with buffering ingredients, this will minimize the troubles. If we look then at the other problems in the stomach, the glandular problems, these are much less known. They can affect both the body of the stomach and the pyloric, the antrum, or the pyloric part of the stomach. It's different diseases that we have in this mucosa. It can be inflammation, it can be ulceration, it can be infections. All are behind the same hat of glandular gastric diseases. So it's a shame because their etiologies are different. And then the way to afford the prevention or the treatment are also different. So it's much less known, the pathophysiology of this EGGD. And it's fascinating because the topic of my PhD some years ago. Some colleagues in the US exhibited that the horses that were diseased of glandular gastric diseases did not have the same microbiota sticking to the mucosa. But it's not because of pathogens. There's no, for instance, Helicobacter incriminated in the incidence of these diseases. However, it might be creating an inflammation. And well, other colleagues in Germany saw that when we were working with mucosa ex vivo, this mucosa facing once again acidic conditions plus volatile fatty acid was aggressed again. Acidic conditions only was not a problem, but volatile fatty acid under acidic condition was problematic. And we demonstrated in vivo that we observed exactly the same thing. And I'm sorry, it's not published yet, but we have measured this 2 or 3 times, and it's becoming more and more evident that the conditions within the stomach will also be associated with this inflammation of the mucosa. And it opens dietary perspectives. And some years ago, we carried out a big clinical trial with horses. We had 80 horses in the beginning. It was not the main purpose of this one, but we observed that when the horses were fed high buffering ingredients, their score of their glandular score was extremely rapidly decreasing, while in the control group, which did not change dietary condition, the diseases remained throughout the monitoring period. So maybe we might have tomorrow some perspectives to monitor either the incidence or even the treatment of these diseases through dietary approaches, maybe using legumes. I'll move now forwards to the problems related to the hind gut diseases. So in the large intestine of the horse, we have a vital ecosystem with a huge amount of microorganisms. I just figured out here some figures so that you can see that it's billions of microorganisms per milliliter of content, and we have 100 liters. It's well known and described for the role in digestion, but it's also essential to the horse and to other mammals like us for the role in health and welfare. When everything is balanced, we have interesting bacteria called symbionts. We have possible dangerous bacteria in the pathobionts. Everything is balanced. But when we're facing stress, like dietary stress, it can be disbalanced. This is characterized by a decrease of symbiont, an increase in the pathobiont, and a decrease in diversity. And this is called a dysbiosis, which means a disbalance of the microbial ecosystem in the hindgut ecosystem of the horse. And this can be associated to nutrition, either brief to rapid changes, abrupt changes in the diet, or to high starch or high fructose diet, sugars that will rapidly ferment in the large intestine. I take the example of sugar, of starch. Starch, I told you, starts being fermented here in the stomach. In the part which is not fermented will continue to the small intestine, and there we have amylase hydrolyzing starch. But when the amount of starch fed is too high, part of starch will reach the hindgut. And in the hindgut, it leads to enormous amounts of lactate, and part of the end products are volatile fatty acids. But lactate is extremely acidic, and it will lead to an acidosis. The problem of this acidosis is that it will disturb the microbiota here. So how much starch can we provide to the horse without problem for this large intestine? This has been reviewed some years ago, and we collected all the information about the amount of starch that could be fed without reaching the large intestine. Up to 1 gram starch per kilo body weight, whatever the source, the botanical source, O for oat, C for corn, B for barley, we don't have much starch reaching the hindgut. But then, the more we add in the diet, the more we find in the large intestine. And the problem is that the acidose will modify deeply the hindgut microbiota. It will first decrease diversity. First problem. It will modulate the species that are present here. If we compare high fiber versus high starch diets. And with the high starch diet, we have more amylolytic, more lacticolytic bacteria. With the high fiber diet, we have more cellulolytic bacteria. So we change who is present, but also the functions present and the diversity of the bacteria. The problem is that, first, the efficiency to digest fibers will not be the same. So nutritionally speaking, it will not be so efficient. But then we will also have health consequences that are huge. First, it creates inflammation because the microbiota in the hindgut is controlled by an immune system of the hindgut. So when you change the species inside, you will change the response of the immune system. And we've demonstrated in one of the last PhD that was carried out in my team that when we modify, because of stress, either dietary stress or medical stress, the ecosystem, facing a huge stress, the composition of the bacteria will not be the same during the stress, and the immune response will not be the same also. And during the stressful period, the immune response will be accentuated. So we create an inflammation. We can see it from a pain perspective. The horses at that time are painful on the cecum, painful on the ventral part, painful also in the back. So this is the first problem. Second problem is that we also have an alteration of the intestinal barrier. The intestinal barrier is here to maintain the bacteria or bacterial product within the lumen, must not go into the bloodstream. The problem is that during the dysbiotic period, we also have an increase in permeability. So all the toxins produced by bacteria or even living bacteria that should remain within the lumen of the hindgut can go through the bloodstream. And so the inflammation does not remain local. It can become systemic. In the horse, this has been measured, and it can lead to laminitis In the worst cases, some colleagues in Australia demonstrated that from a huge dysbiosis in the hindgut, in 48 hours, it leads to laminitis. It can also lead to alterations in water absorption, diarrhea. In the horse, yeah, you have the figuration of the lumen, the colon on the left, and epithelial cells on the right. Fibers are extremely well digested in the large intestine, usually in abiotic conditions. And in the horse, most of water is absorbed in the colon, and the mechanisms have been highlighted some years ago by a colleague in Liverpool, so she has pitchy. And it's a common absorption of volatile fatty acids plus a protein. And then this leads to two antiporters activation. And it will induce absorption of sodium. And sodium leads by diffusion to the absorption of water. If we disturb fiber digestion because of a dysbiosis, because of acidic conditions, because of medicines, then we don't have the same amount of VFA produced. And it leads to alterations in water absorption, so to diarrhea. If we continue, it can also lead to behavioral modifications. We have correlated some years ago dysbiosis to anxiety, nervosity. As said Andrea earlier, it's part of welfare we are speaking about. And it can also be related to other parameters of health we did not imagine some years ago, like parasitism in horses. So this was one of the last PhD defended in our team 2 years ago or last year. We demonstrated that under these biotic conditions, when horses are fed high-starch diet, which lead to disturbances of the hindgut microbiota, we have a huge increase in egg excretion in fecal counts in the horses. And when the conditions are stable, the fecal counts were quite stable, so the spongial fertility did not increase. So it can lead also to parasitic problems that we did not imagine in the beginning. So the list is quite long. And if I should then end with a take-home message, it's that understanding how it works is key to health and to welfare or performance, as we'll explain later, Emanuela. And if I would just give some very brief advices, we should feed this microbiota. And to feed the microbiota, it's necessary to provide fibers. This will be the first energy source of microbes. And we should take care to minimize stresses. The first care will be to minimize very rapidly fermented sugars entering the large intestine. The first of them will be starch. And we should also care on the transitions. When we drastically, abruptly change the diet, this leads to the same disturbances as the one I've illustrated. And finally, we should not only think when we do rationing, we should not only think of just meeting the required amount of energy or protein. We must absolutely think, if we want to maintain health, to the qualitative approach. Do I meet energy requirements with the good nutrients, respecting physiology, ingestive or digestive physiology? Well, I thank you, and we'll be happy to take some of your questions, and we'll be happy also to meet some of you probably in September in Hanover, or maybe earlier in Lisbon, I saw Maria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sammy, for that really clear and interesting presentation. I'm looking for questions to come in for you, which will take always a little while. if I can find the questions, of course.
So if I take the
yeah,
question in
there
French,
is already a
I
first
take it.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 50 grams.
Yeah, it means about, if we look at, this is in diameter, and if we go back from 15 grams fiber per kilo body weight, if we go back to the amount for 500 kilo horse, this will probably be about 10 kilogram per day. So it means about 10 hours per day of ingestion. And it's a minimum. If we want to have more, it can be more. It's not problematic. And Andrea illustrated that it's not an ingestion problem. We have more.
Yeah. It was very much the minimum requirement, wasn't it? So not the optimum.
And this is in terms of fibers. It's cellulose plus semicellulose, and its recommendation for microbiome, hindgut microbiome ecosystem. Below, it's risky.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question. Can you comment on the digestible and indigestible fiber types related to digestive problems?
Sure. When we speak of fibers in herbivores, it will be polysaccharides that reach the hindgut without being fermented before. So it's cellulose and hemicellulose, and which can be fermented. So lignin will not enter these fibers. And so lignin will have different consequences on digestive tract. First, it will slow down transit in the stomach and in the small intestine, and it's associated with various diseases in these segments. But then in the large intestine, as it's indigestible, it's also associated with an increase in colics, especially when we have lignin plus highly fermentable carbohydrates in the diet. So when we combine straw plus cereals, then the odd ratio related to colics increases deeply. And so we should take care, not relying only on straw or high lignin forage in the diets.
Yeah. It might be useful a little bit to reduce the calorific content, but it shouldn't be the main part of the diet.
Yeah.
Although some geographical regions, I mean, some early cut barley and oat straws, they're nearly more like Hayden. And in some very hot countries, that's all they have sometimes. Yeah, so there was one more question. Do you have specific recommendations for horses with higher needs, like growing foals, sports horses? It sort of starts veering a little bit into Emanuela's talk, but
I'll just maybe take the growing foals and I'll let the sports horses to Emanuela. So regarding, yes, high demanding animals, we can account in forage. It's absolutely not a problem. So the last PhD that has been defended in our team was about fibers. Andrea knows that. It was about fiber digestion and metabolic energy, metabolism and performance. And we demonstrated that the horses that were fed almost only forage at top level racing horses fed good sources of fibers, they used more volatile fatty acids for their energy metabolism, and when they were facing extremely intense exercise, their metabolic acidosis was delayed and they performed more. So indeed, it's possible, even for extremely high demanding horses, to rely on fibers to provide energy. It's not exclusively fibers that will be necessary. We can also have cereals and concentrates in parallel. The things to keep in mind will be not to overpass the amount to disturb the functioning of the large intestine, which will fuel mostly the horse. So for these animals, indeed, we can account in, or English will call that super fibers, fibers that are extremely well fermented, like alfalfa fibers like sugar beet pulp fibers or haylage fibers, the ratio of energy from each kilogram provided is higher. And in these specific cases, indeed, it can be of high importance.
Yeah. The
I'll stop
perfect
here.
introduction, really, for the next speaker.
Yes.
I think so. We have a couple of questions left, which we perhaps can leave for the end then, because we need to save a couple for the end. So
Thank you.
I'll hand the chairmanship back to you, Sammy, to take over.
Thank you very much. Well, I give it right now to Emanuela.
So thank you so much, Sami, for the introduction. And we are going to look at some consideration for feeding sport horses. Andrea and Sami has already talked about a very important topic for feeding them. And in my presentation, I would like to share some experience that come up to us when we feed sport horses, especially common belief related body condition, muscle condition, energy sources, the role of forage, feeding management, and water. So I will try to make up a kind of holistic approach, because a feed is just a piece of the cake to manage the sport horses, because the welfare for them is really, really important. Take into account nutrition and all the management. Just to introduce myself, I work in Torino. Here we have the hospital where we have a different kind of colleagues, patient mainly. So we have horses with different disease, but we see also with my team horses at the stable, or we do online consultancies. In the hospital, we see a lot of horses with colics, but also medical problems like laminitis, hyperlipemia, and so on. And when we go to the stable, we go to see riding schools, horses of different type and shape. We go to breeding farm to helping them to try to manage and growing horses. And naturally, we see also a lot of sport horses. Naturally, many of them are top horses, but actually a horse is a horse. And for us, all the horses have the same need, with the same approach for diet, management, environment, training, because welfare and performance are really interconnected each other. So when we look to sport horses, we know that are extraordinary athletes. They can do big jump, they can do dressage, they can do a lot of different disciplines like eventing. So actually, they are not playing, but they perform high level. But any horse has a specific requirement according to their sport that we need to understand. So nutrition is not a simple topic, and today we are not going to discuss all the requirements because it's a huge topic. But we should always think that with nutrition we can affect behavior, emotional state, health, muscle development, and performance consistencies. So when we feed the sport horses, we should always keep in mind that we are not going to feed categories like dressage, jumping, racing, but we need to feed individuals. So my presentation is an invite for you to revise how you approach feeding a sport horses. Sami has told to us that we need to talk about physiology, and this is the starting point that we can never discuss. Today, we are going to look to some common belief regarding nutrition, common statement that usually owners tell to us when we make a diet. The first one is, my horse is round because he has muscle. However, roundness do not automatically reflect muscle development. Unfortunately, when we are going to measure body condition for horses, we have just indirect method like body condition and muscle condition score. And however, we need to apply these methods to try to measure the condition of the horse. And body condition score is not enough, because two horses can have the same body condition but different muscle development. And this is really important for sport horses. So we spend a lot of time to train owners to understand muscular condition, body condition, and always we ask them, which is the condition that your horse should have? And they usually answer that the horse should have a condition between 7 and 9, because roundness is usually preferred by people according to baby schema. And that is really a difficult point to manage, because usually that condition means that the horse are obese. However, today we have also some standardized method to monitor muscle condition. And recently we have a development of equine muscle condition score, and also a muscular atrophy scoring system that is more useful for aged horses or horses with metabolic problem. Usually we apply an equine muscle condition, so we monitor different parts of the horse body, and we teach owner and people to understand that usually fat has the consistencies of a foam ball for tennis. Instead, when we are looking to muscle, we have more resistance, like a regular tennis ball. So looking to that horse, that was a very famous eventing horse, competing high level, we can say he had a good body condition for his categories for sport. But actually, when we want to look to muscle condition score, he has a low muscle condition. Which is the problem? We can have different kind of reason, but when I went to see the diet, actually he was receiving 10 to 12 kilos of meadow hay. Italian typical meadow hay has 7 to 8% of crude protein, and cereal-based concentrate with 12% of crude protein. And you can see that protein level were not satisfied for high demanding sport horses, such as also the lysine content. So it's not just a matter of energy, because energy may be sufficient to keep the body condition. But if we look to protein quality and quantity, is not enough for that horse. So what we usually use to feed sport horses are recommendations specifically made for them. NRC suggests us to stay between 1.4-2 grams crude protein for body weight of horse as crude protein, but actually we usually follow the rules for high demanding and very intensive work between 2.5 grams of crude protein each day for sport horses. We also look to lysine and threonine content that are specific amino acid, and usually we stay around 0.1 grams kilo body weight day for lysine and 0.08 grams kilo body weight day for threonine. So we look to the quantities of protein given by forage and concentrate, and we decide if we need to add other amino acid or protein in the diet. If we go to see this other horse, who was a show jumping horse, again, we were not with a horse with a good body condition, because the muscle condition score was really low, the body condition score was low. So this horse was eating around 12 kilos of meadow hay, a concentrate based on cereal with the 13% of crude protein. And actually, crude protein and lysines and energy were quite enough, but we asked to perform other analysis. And what we saw, that the vitamin level were really, really low for that horse. So improving the diet quality in terms of proteins, quality and quantities, but also other elements like vitamin E is really important. And grazing some green grass, especially in the spring, helps them to keep and having vitamin E. So when we look to sport horses, we need to look to body condition, and the fat sport horses should lose weight to have the good body condition in terms of fat reserve, but also muscle reserve. The other myths that usually we encounter is that my horse need a lot of energy from cereal for jumping, so they has to adding oat, for example. Sammy has already talked about the effect of high starch diet. So when we are going to make a diet for any sport horses, we should always start from the pyramids that say we need to use forage. And forage for many sport horses is hay, haylage, and a little bit of grass if they are lucky and they have it in the stable or in the paddock. All the horses usually needs to have balancer, vitamins and minerals, and proteins also. If this is not enough in terms of energy, we need to add concentrate. And concentrate can be based on cereal or fat and fiber feed. When we use cereals, we need to stick these rules. So we do a diet that have less than 2 grams kilo body weight daily of starch and sugar, usually less or equal to 1 grams kilos body weight of starch for each meal. If we need to increase a little bit the quantities, we need to increase the number of meal rather than the size. So we need always to look to the analysis of the feed, because if we want to set up these rules of 1 grams kilo body weight of starch for meal, for example, for a 500 kilos body weight horse with a 50% of starch, we need to give him maximum 1 kilos. But if the content is the 40%, we can stay around 1.3 kilos, or even if it's lower, we can arrive around 1.7 kilos for each meal. So look to the label and make the analysis of the feed. We are really strict with that. And when we do diet for the horse in our hospital, always we think to that, because we did a lot of study even on different effects of starch and forage-based diet. Federica, my PhD student, she did a great job. She raised the meat horses for 1 year almost, and we fed them with high starch diet or high forage-based diet. And actually, that's microscopically the effect that you can see on the jejunum of the starchy feed horse or forage-based horse. Even in the colon, you have the same effect, because as you can see, the starch feed group was more foamy with a lot of gas. So we have a fat that we can measure. And when we go to see to the histopathological evaluation, we can see that the diet had an effect on inflammation of the jejunum with lymphoplasmacytic enteritis, or the pelvic flexor, where again we had this kind of histopathological alteration. So diet has a profound effect on the histology, and this can lead to leaky gut. Actually, we have measured that in our study, and we saw that we have a translocation of the total mesophilic aerobic bacterial counts. So the high starch group has more TMAB in mesenteric lymph nodes and in the liver. So actually we have this passage of the bacteria in liver and mesenteric lymph node. The other myth that usually we encounter is that people say to us, we cannot rely on forage-based diet. It's not sufficient to my horse. He's not going to perform well. Actually, for me, having a ad libitum forage-based diet for a horse is a dream that can help really to manage them, especially for its welfare. And we have different studies that actually say that horses can be trained and raised even on a forage-based diet with good result. This leads to metabolic changes like a more aerobic turnover, increase of the pH and blood glucose, decrease in plasma lactate. Actually, these metabolic adaptations are beneficial for many performance across different equine disciplines. Again, we have a recent study from our colleague Semi that again showed to us that high fiber diets can be helpful for horses performing racing, especially standardbred. And actually, I really like the conclusion of the study because they say that this shift toward better fiber digestion is beneficial during high intensity exercise, and that has really long potential advantages for sport horses. So our goal is to promote a high forage based diet for them. We have saw that we have such a big, let's say, good benefit from feeding forage only diet in sport horses, but is it really possible feeding them just with forage? Actually, sometimes is not possible because forage should be really high quality. It means the energy density should be at least 10.5 megajoule of metabolized energy for kilos of dry matter, but also we should take into account of crude protein, vitamin, minerals level that are going to satisfy the requirement of high performance horses. However, today, when we are going to look to the forage quality of the hay, we can have a lot of problem, even for the climatic changes that we encounter. Many times the hay is not sufficient from the nutritional point of view, is not digestible, and unfortunately can have dust and mold. The other things that we should think when we look to sport horses, they can have really tight traveling schedule and they change every time site of the competition around the world. So when we look to forage quality, we did a report when we pointed out some of the problems that we see when we are going to look to forage quality, because that can influence the gut system, but also can influence the health of the gums. You can see here that horses has this spike in the gums because they were feeding with the Setaria hay. Especially we find hay with spike, with weeds like Setaria or Echinocloa, but also hay that is not well harvested, that can cause colics or gum problems. Other thing that we should take into account is the nutritive value. So we need to analyze the hay. Sometimes we find hay that have protein values around 5 to 6%. That is not enough for sport horses. And also, due to the resting condition, the hay can be moldy and dusty. And that is another important point for respiratory problem of an athletic horse. Also, our horses, when they are in competition, they have a really high working traveling schedule. Change the quality of the hay and do not have many times, unfortunately, appropriate time to eat the required amount of forage because they are traveling, they are stressed, they are not at home, so they can have difficulty. For example, if we look to a horse that is doing the Global Champions Tour, can travel from New York to Madrid and to the finals in Riyadh. And these changes are not beneficial because they change frequently the hay, and they travel a lot and do not have time to eat what they need. So they are fasted a long time. So if ad libitum hay is not possible, or haylage is often not really possible, we need to be sure that our horses receive a specific quantities of forage. Usually the minimum is 15 grams of dry matter kilo body weight, but actually we should stay around 2% of the body weight. What does it mean? For a 500 kilo horse with a hay that can have 87% of dry matter, we should give around 10 kilos of dry matter a day of hay, or around 11-12 kilos as feed basis of hay. That should be increased if we are going to feed haylage according to dry matter content. When we respect these quantities, we are on the right side of our diet plan, because that is going to promote all the benefit that we were discussing previously. So forage is always the foundation of the diet of the horse. Which form we should look at? Long fiber. Andrea tells us that the horse needs to chew adequately, but also having specific intake time. And long fiber can help the horse to chewing. We have on the market different products like chaff, cubes, buffer. They are not hay replacer, but they can be a part of the diet, and specifically also for sport horses that are traveling a lot, and also to increase the quantities of forage that they are going to take. Also, they can be helpful because usually we advise the owner to give this product with water. Since they have a water holding capacity, we are sure that we can try to increase the quantities of the water that the horse receive, another important factor in sport horses. Other two common beliefs that we encounter by the owner is that feeding a concentrate meal 1 hour before exercise is enough, or my horse should not receive hay before competition. Actually, that's are not true. And what we think when we should to give concentrate, we should always to think to time and composition, because the quantities of the pre-exercise meal can influence performance. Especially, they can influence fluid balance, both blood flow distribution, but also the bioenergetic substrate that the horse can use. So it's not only what you feed, but also when, that can shape metabolic response and performance. My recommendation is always not to feed a cereal-based feed or a feed that can result in increasing blood insulin level in the 3 hours before exercise. And always respect the suggestion of 1 grams of starch and sugar products body weight in the pre-exercise meal. That is really, really important for the metabolic shaping of the horse. Also, Semi showed to us that the stomach has 2 portions. And when we look to, it's not working. When we look to the gut, the stomach, we can always see that inside there is some acid. And that acid is what is causing the splashing effect due to the physiological pressure that we have in the abdomen when the horse is cantering or galloping or jumping. So, feeding small amounts of forage before competition, like 2 hours before, can be useful because that promotes slow chewing, salivation, without too much gut feeling. For that reason, we suggest them to put a little bit of hay in a small hole or double hay net to slow down the consumption. Before the competition or the exercise, we also suggest to give a horse a little bit of chaff. Usually we suggest alfalfa chaff if it's available, but the horse should be adapted at home. So it's something that usually the horse is eating also at home. Adding a small amount of based chaff, alfalfa based chaff before exercise is really useful because glandular and non-glandular disease are really common in show jumping horses. So that can be helpful because it's going to create the fiber mat that they need in the stomach. The last myth that we are going to see is that my horse should not drink if he's hot and sweaty. Actually, water is really important for all sporting horses, and providing constant access to water is essential. Inadequate intake can lead to dehydration, and is something that we do not want. Even after exercise, we need to offer to the horse small and frequent amount of water because that led to the horse to rehydrate, and that is really, really important. When we are to competition, we need also to check the water bowel because they can have different pressure, and that is something that is not going to work for some horses. Also, the age of the water bowel, and for many horses it's important to have the favorite bucket with the favorite color and flavor. This is important to make them to drink more. Usually we recommend them to feed wet feed and always to think to electrolyze. Unfortunately, we do not have time to think to electrolyze, but in my experience, the most forgotten electrolyte is the salt. They need salt that is not included in concentrate or in many supplements for horses. So taking into account the kitchen salt in their diet is fundamental. My take-home message is that sport horses are really extraordinary athletes, and we need to manage the nutrition without compromising the health and the welfare. So we have many aspects to evaluate, and we have so just a little of this aspect. But our goal is promote a forage-based diet, respecting the starch limits and meal time, safeguard microbiome and gut, and adapt the diet to individual, not the category. So if we truly want to have a good sport horse, we need to account to different aspects and always to think that we are not just feeding them, we are caring of their life. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. So is there any question for Emanuela? First question for you, Emanuela. In winter, is there a risk if horses drink extremely cold water?
Yeah, usually horses like to drink water that is over 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. They drink more, so the real big risk is that when they drink, when it's really cold, they are not really to drink so much, because they don't like to when the water is really cold. So actually in the winter we need to keep care the fact that the horse is going to drink enough, and the temperature of the water that is given to the horse is around 10 degrees at least.
Any other question for Emanuela? I got one for you, waiting for the next ones. Would you recommend different diets for endurance horses, race horses, and, for instance, eventing or jumping horses? Or would you think the same approach for all of them?
Yeah, we can make a little bit of adaptation according to the sport. You know, we have difference between endurance horses or racing horses, or let's say classical discipline horse. But the starting point when you balance a diet, it's always the forage. So you start from forage, and from that you are going to look to the other nutrient, like for example for endurance horses we are going to look specifically for fat content in the diet, but for racing horses we take into account also, for example, the cereal content of the diet, but always take into account the physiology of the digestion of the horse.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question for Emanuela? Yes, to balance the different diets, do you evaluate the working load?
Thank you. This is a really hard topic, you know, understand how much the horse is working. Because if you ask to the owner, usually they say a lot. But if you look to the horses, not always they are hard-working horses. It depends. So what we can use to understand the working load? We have different opportunity. We can use, for example, a polar device where we can monitor the mean heart rate during session. And so there are formula that help us to count the energy. We can use a beautiful chart that Andrea has developed many years ago about how to understand the working load, and that is really nice. Usually it's working well. Or we look at the body condition score of the horse and look how much is eating. So you try to make the balance. Using these three elements, you can understand the working load of the horse according to the, let's say, the requirements.
Any other question? So thank you. And
I could have a question here.
Andrea, yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question. We listened to a really nice little sort of online seminar the last few days from the Royal Agricultural University. And one of the topics they discussed is that, and this is a question to both of you, that most of the, or that possibly a lot of the protein in the forage will not be coming free, the amino acids will not be coming free in the foregut. And it sort of obviously depends on the type of forage, but how much is that in your minds true and a problem if we're feeding high forage to top performance horses?
I can answer for my, let's say, experience. Protein, it's always a problem, you know, because our forage, at least in Italy, has really low quantities of protein, and the forage is quite late, so the amino acids are not really available. So usually it's hard to make a forage-based diet with a high protein content. We need to go to legumes hay like alfalfa, but even in that case, the quality of the protein, it's not always, let's say, high, because in many times, according to the harvesting, we are losing the protein in the leaves that are going on the ground and so on. So it's not easy to feeding sport horses with the right quantities of protein. Yeah.
Mm.
Yes, and
yeah.
I would say that was one of the questions which pointed out that in terms of proteins, is there a risk in horses that receive more than they need? Well, I agree with Emanuela. Most of the problem rely rather on the low energy rather than on the high energy protein diets. And we pointed out that there were very, very little studies in the horses exhibiting that there were problems feeding high protein diets. The horse is very efficient to digest proteins. So when we feed them proteins, this will increase absorption and then excretion. So when there are urinary tract diseases, when there are renal diseases, kidney diseases, this is not recommended. But for most horses, it's absolutely not problematic. And there is no problem, at least for the small intestine and the ingut in these cases. So we have more problems with low than with high proteins diet. In sport horses, well, this is a challenge to provide a good amount. It's not so easy. And I would just point out that chronology in the day would be of interest. It's not the same to feed protein all through the day or to have times, because there are slots after exercise where it's more used for instance, proteosynthesis. So this is something that we've not discussed, but probably could be of interest, not only to think on a daily basis, but also on an hour basis, the diets.
Yeah. I just wonder if, in particular, for that reason, a balancer is often much more useful than feeding a high sugar or starch diet, because the balancer will supply the additional essential amino acids and vitamins and minerals, rather than people going for the concentrate feed as a whole. But it'd be nice to have a similar study as we have for the starch pre and post-cecal digestibility, with different amino acids nearly, because it's an area we know the least about. But I certainly always personally recommend looking at the digestible protein rather than just the crude protein for that reason.
Indeed, yeah. And it's absolutely necessary to have part of the proteins reaching the hindgut. Well, we do quite a lot of studies targeting the hindgut microbiota. And when we cultivate microbes from the hindgut microbiota, when there is no amino acids, they do not grow. So it's absolutely necessary for the metabolism.
Yeah.
Maybe just a word of conclusion, Emanuela, Andrea, if you would highlight just one or two ideas of your presentation, what would it be? Andrea?
Well, mine is pretty easy. I would highlight trying to facilitate the 12 hours of foraging behavior for horses, even for top performance horses a day, if they're not in the process of traveling. And even then, something, I would say, where there's a will, there is a way. And if you want them to have a good life, I would really highlight trying to facilitate that for horses.
Emanuela, for you.
Yeah, for me, the highlights is that we need to think for a horse as an holistic approach. And when we make diet, we should always start from forage. People start from concentrate, but if we look from forage and we give the right quantities of forage, half of the job is done. Maybe we need just a balancer, but we need the starting from forage, good quality forage.
Thank you. So 12 hours a day, forage first and good quality forage. And I will end with maybe understanding physiology. We've been speaking quite a lot with this. So when we have the functioning it's much easier to understand the beginning of the troubles and then have accurate recommendations based on ingestive physiology or digestive physiology. And this will lead then to a qualitative approach of nutrition and not only a quantitative approach of nutrition.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, many thanks to all of you. Should you be interested in listening again to some presentations, I think that will be online, and we'll meet again in the next congresses in Portugal soon, in Germany in autumn, or elsewhere. It will be a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.